Hello and welcome to the January 11, 2023 edition of the Austin Software Cooperative Meetup. Today we are doing part two of the book review of Guilds in the Middle Ages. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to start off with chapter 4 here. And the main goal is to try to critique and maybe even superimpose the ideas of a cooperative and the ideas of a guild. And there's some overlap there. There's also overlap between guilds and unions, although unions don't actually claim that they're historically related to guilds for some reason. So let's see, let's make this a bit bigger. So the little bit of review, just starting off with chapter 4. They the purpose of the guild really had three points. So you had an economic aim, a social and moral aim, and a political aim. And these are kind of interrelated. So really, like it says here, Guild was first and foremost a fighting organization for the defense of the trade interests of those who belong to it. It prided itself on letting nothing leave its shops but finished products. So guilds were really about the quality of the output. And then also remember, you had multiple shops. So I guess sometimes when people think of a guild, they think of just one shop, but it's really all the shops. So the multiple carpenters, let's say, they were all part of a guild. And the guild enforced and kind of levied fines and everything on all the shops. They also had, like it says here, it maybe even had a stamp that it would put on the articles or trademarks, so on and so forth. We're going to talk some more, but there is a difference between the smaller guilds and the bigger guilds, and that became more pronounced over a couple hundred years, where the bigger guilds, and bigger meant either in size or in wealth, became more powerful. So the book calls the great commerce guilds, or it also calls them the great industrial guilds. Those were the bigger ones. And so they concentrated on rules that were about the bargains, the duty of paying the denier, and things about that regulated payment altogether. Things that were kind of during various points of the life of the great guilds, whether it would be within the city or at the nation level. So going back into that, there's a such thing. There were certain towns that were kind of still over or still under the power of kind of a feudal lord, that they kind of directed it more closely. And then there were towns that we'll talk about that were more free. We kind of either paid off the feudal lord or actually defeated them in battles where they kind of won their freedom, and then the guilds were kind of the ones kind of making the rules. So in the free towns, the guilds were making a license for the people that would for in the different industries. Let's see here. Let's go on to, so you have the economics, which is really about, at first, about the worker, and then it started being more. The interest started splitting between the kind of two classes. So here we have the moral and social aim. So trying to establish that there's going to be honest competition, and that changed over time and what honest competition would be. So desired to prevent the great from crushing the small, the rich from ruining the poor. And in order to succeed, it tried to make advantages and charges equal for all. Its motto was solidarity. For instance, people couldn't buy up all the raw material. Um, let's say, like it said here, if the arrival of fresh fish, hay, wine, wheat, or leather was announced, no one can forestall the others and buy cheaply to sell dearly. All should profit equally from the natural course of events. So one shop couldn't go out and buy up all the leather from a shipment and then have all the other shops that were creating clothing not be able to produce any clothing, and they just sit on the leather, which is interesting because that's kind of a strategy for, I think it's called Gorilla Glass for the um, phones. Apple and other makers will go out there and try to buy all of the Gorilla Glass up so that other phones can't have it. And then, but they won't even use all of it. All right. So this is an example of some things as far as the morality and ethics of guilds. Apart from the obligatory assistance at certain offices, at funerals for its members, a fraternity owned a chest, that is to say, a fund maintained out of subscriptions and voluntary donations of its members, as well as by the fines which they incurred. Of these funds collected from various sources, part was given to the poor and to the hospitals and to the expenses of worship. Right. So, and then it talks over here a little bit more about, I want to say it was another place where it starts talking about how the guilds would fund the hospitals and so on and so forth. Where they also would donate their time if they were a doctor or so on. Um, so that was more on the moral and social aims, and then the political aims, and this one's pretty hefty. Guilds necessarily came into relation with the authorities. They were far from being absolutely sovereign communities unrelated to society around them. They retained ties of dependence, which reminded them that their emancipation was both recent and incomplete. So this is where I'm saying they were freed themselves. I think it talks about it here. In most cases, they had extorted or bought from the Lord their earliest privileges. According to the feudal conception, the right to work was a concession which he granted or refused at will, and it followed that he kept the prerogatives of supervising and regulating the guilds, whose existence he sanctioned and protected. The guilds joined forces with all the lower classes against lay or ecclesiastical feudalism. They took an honorable part in the insurrection of the communes and took their share also in the spoils of victory. They won important liberties. And as each guild formed a little sort of city in which members discussed, deliberated, and voted, a miniature republic in which they received their civic education. So this guilds, and the kind of superimposing this over like cooperatives, it's a way for, they were acting democratically. They were like a little government, even when they were under a the remnants of a feudal lord. So there were other towns that were free. Okay. With regards to freedom, the towns ranged between two extremes. There were those in which a power external to the burgess, a king, lord, pope, bishop, abbot, remained full of life, active and capable of making itself respected, such was the case in France and England, and for a long time in Rome. And there were others, on the contrary, which the burgess almost eliminated every element foreign to their class, in which they absorbed the wealth and jurisdiction of the bishop, in which they subdued the nobles and forced them either to give up their interfering or to become plebeians by joining the guilds, in which they created real republics of their own, constitution, budget, army, and mint, all dangers and all the prerogatives of practically complete sovereignty, such as was the case in Florence, Venice, Ghent, Strasbourg, and in the imperial towns, which had nothing to fear from the impotent or distant phantoms who claimed to be the successors to Caesar or Charlemagne. So this here is we did a review on a book, what was it, Mutual Aid, and Kropotkin is the name. He would talk about how there were towns that were free, and then they were doing a lot of the architecture, the workers, and they weren't commissioned top down. Here's an example, and they talk about that in this book as well. Here's an example of these of some of these towns. This list here: Florence, Venice, Ghent, Strasbourg, so on and so forth, where they were not. They were sovereign essentially, and there were guilds. So it wasn't kind of there were tiers. There was the higher level guilds and the lower level guilds, and we'll talk about that. And there are also what they call the masters, the journeymen, and the apprentices. So they had those levels, but it wasn't like a king, like a Game of Thrones situation. Yeah, so here's some of what I was saying before. They had to guarantee, the guilds were making sure that the individual workers had to guarantee certain public services. To building guilds was assigned the provision of safeguards against fire. To the doctors and barber surgeon guilds, the care of the sick, poor, and of the hospitals. To all and nearly all, the assessment of certain taxes, the policing of the streets, and sometimes defense of the ramparts. All right. So then here they're talking about in Paris, where regular guilds people were patrolling the streets. So this is kind of going into an argument that for a couple hundred years, there wasn't kind of a state, that there was a separate group that was like you can imagine, like a Game of Thrones. There were knights in the city that patrolled the streets, and they kind of acted like the police do now. There were back then in these, especially in these free towns, but even in the other towns that weren't free, there's really the guilds commissioning this type of thing. So it was very much intermingled with the politics. And then from the mutual aid standpoint, it was driven by a need and less of kind of some type of sanctioning top down role or efficiencies type of thing. All right, let's go. We're gonna move over to the next chapter here. Buzz by this pretty quickly. The merits and the defects of the guild system. So we're going to get into how the guilds started to disintegrate. And this was kind of over the course of maybe 400 years. So the first thing is there are two types of guilds, like I was saying, the guilds of the small crafts and the guilds of the great commerce and great industry. So the guilds of the small crafts was once a guarantee of and a check on production and sales. It endeavored to ensure and guard the consumer against adulteration, which is a funny word. I had to look it up. It basically means, adding or diluting things. So if you were to sell wine, adding water to the wine kind of thing so that you can dilute it and have more bottles. Falsification and dishonesty, to stamp the goods with a character of finish, solidarity, and relative perfection, thus giving to them something personal and therefore artistic, and to keep within reasonable limits the profits of the manufacturer, who was also the merchant. And this is important later. And so kind of you think about this and you say, adulteration, falsification, dishonesty, those are kind of now government organizations like Department of Commerce, the FCC, those types of things. Um, Interesting that that kind of stuff was handled by guilds back then. Okay, so the guild was not only a great family for those who belonged to it, it was a little self-contained city, a diminutive commune, which the members administered at will and thereby prepared themselves for civic life and duties. It was a training ground for independent, well-informed, active citizens who, with their parliamentary traditions, Republican sentiments, and democratic hopes, formed with their fellow craftsmen of other crafts a proud, practical, and courageous middle class, as anxious to defend their town from outsiders as to beautify and adorn it. As a side note, and this seems like a cooperative wrote that as a side note, there is more at this time, it's equal or more inequality between the top and the bottom than there was during the Gilded Age. All right, so guilds of the great commerce and of the great industry also had their fine sense of honor, their complicated regulations, and their exclusive spirit. But what distinguished them was the fact that their capital was large and that they dealt with a vast market. Consequently, while the former was busy with exchange and transport, traversed land and sea with their convoys and constituted themselves with carriers and brokers of the world. The latter intensified production. They possessed workshops, which for those days were very large, and in order to lower their general expenses, were interested in new inventions and willingly adopted mechanical methods. At Florence, for example, metallic carders, which were still prohibited in Great Britain, were already in use under the guild system. Banking, commercial, and maritime law, the science of finance, the art of production on a large scale, and of securing international relations certainly owe a great deal to these merchants and manufacturers who are the precursors of modern capitalists. So this is kind of the big separation in craftsmanship, artisans, or what have you. We would talk about it some more as far as how the guild breakdown was. But this group here, bankers, commercial maritime law, so people that were import export, finance, production on a large scale, these guilds that were interacting with that, because there were banking guilds and so on, those became the ones that had more power over these guilds, which would be like a metalsmith or what have you. And they started to learn about exploitation, and they had more bargaining power. They were able to control the state. At the same time, they broke up that solidarity, which was the very soul of the primitive guilds. They created a social system which perpetuated riches above, poverty below. They enslaved and cruelly exploited the clerks and workers they employed. Their attitude towards whom was no longer that of masters towards journeymen or I don't know how you pronounce this word. I'm just going to say companions, but that of lords towards dependents. I think this is a French word. Uh, so this is the beginning of capital and people not having that much say in what it is that in the fruits of their labor and what they're developing. And even though they were a guild. So I would say these would be closer, the small craft guilds would be more closer to cooperatives. There would have to be, I mean, just going by the industries here, these industries, these would need to be, in order for them to be cooperatives, they would need to be revisited um, and regulations put on them. Let's move over to chapter 6 real quick. Here we go. So this is going to be, it's split in between as far as the decay of the guilds. There are external causes and internal causes. We're going to do the externals first. So it's split into the market, intellectual conditions, and political conditions. The market was a big change. And I just say at a high level, it ended up being because of markets getting bigger. So instead of serving 1,000 or 10,000 people, started serving hundreds of thousands of people because of import, export, boats, these types of things. The manufacturers that were able to do, in my words, not the author words, economies of scale, they started amassing more worth, more wealth, and therefore more power, and able to secure higher positions within the city, and then what eventually became the state of the different countries. And then they started changing the laws to benefit them. So this is the precursor of kind of a pay-to-play government system. All right. So, okay, extensions of the market and results. The 15th century saw the formation of the great states in Europe. So we had France started to be a nation at the time, which interesting. A new situation arose for the cities, among those which every state still had up to now been on equal footing with the capital and diminished prestige and importance. So the cities started having to negotiate with each other, but before, the cities were sovereign. So the guilds would have rules where if you're trying to bring something in to trade with us, you're going to have to abide by our rules. Maybe they won't even allow it. And so it wouldn't hurt you could say, jobs within the city. So it says here, national economy copied the methods of the city. Production transformed to meet the needs of the trade. Capitalism, which had been confined to a few towns, received the impetus and developed with rigor. This is important to remember here. So 3 functions that previously united in the person of the small craftsmen of the towns became separated. So those of the merchant, who bought raw materials and sold finished goods, those of the manufacturer, who possessed the appliances of labor, and those of the workman who wrought with his own hands. So this was all one person before. Now it's separated into traders, who are not producers but act as middlemen between producer and consumer, deciding what shall be producing, concerning themselves solely with buying and selling. Industrial capitalists, who at the tradesmen's orders direct the transformation for raw materials entrusted to them in workshops with machinery, which are their property. So this is definitely the definition of the means of production. So people owning the machinery that creates the outputs. So this is capitalism. And then they had the workmen, who were wage earners and carry out manual or mechanical work as they're told. Now it's split. These 3 classes have different interests. The big merchants, with their bold speculations, are impatient of anything that hinders circulation. Town dues, customers, tools, differences of coinage, eights and measures, you know what that is, all regulations, everything, in fact, which tends to isolate towns and countries. So at the big merchants, like we were saying, that first, the big guilds, and now the big merchants, they're the ones that kind of what you can hear now kind of would be what would be called globalization. They don't like any regulation between any markets, any countries, any cities, or anything like that. That is in direct That's the direct opposite of the interests of workers. The workers want to have some type of safeguard where they you can't hire other people to replace them very easily, um, and they don't like to be able to, other goods and items being sold locally cheaper than what they produce them as. So that's where the different interests are. So manufacturers, for their part, were not averse to being protected against foreign competition. They were indeed inclined to ask for this protection. In order to produce much and profitably, they were in need of cheap and abundant labor, ignoring the rules of apprenticeship. They hired foreigners, peasants, women, and children. So this here was the beginning of uh, creating a larger labor force. And then this was the killing of apprenticeship and the journeyman. So all of the promise of, which was the old promise of upward mobility, they were, I don't want to say all of it, but there wasn't a promise of it at that point. The old promise of upward mobility was apprenticeship, journeyman, master, and then this one was you're going to be a lifelong worker. Great commerce and great industry continued to develop in the direction they originally had taken, and finally overcame the old-fashioned timidity of the guilds, which gradually, were gradually reduced to defending the interests of the small class. The guilds and their statutes were of but feeble assistance in calming these effects. The greater part of the workers in the great industries did not belong to them. So this is like what you could call the peasants in the great industries. So it could be, let's just say, metalwork or boat making or what have you. Most of them were not part of that, and so they didn't have enough power. So now, but there's a little pushback in here again, that we're talking about 300, 400 years that this all took place over. And so you have the Freemasons, and you have what's called I'm going to call it the companionage. I don't know how to pronounce that. Both of these acted on behalf of the workers. The Freemasons were obviously, no, I say obviously, but if you have never heard of them, they seem pretty secretive. But the argument here is that they were about essentially taking the place of the workers, and kind of an alliance for their rights. And the aim of the association was to keep in order the crowds of half nomadic laborers. So this is talking about how they formed. So the Freemasonry, as far as it is possible to pierce the myths which envelop its early history, was essentially a federation of building trades. It took its birth from the bands of workmen who had their raison d'etre, reason for existence, in the construction of those vast cathedrals whose harmonious proportions are certainly the most perfect legacy left to us by the Middle Ages. Again, this is an argument for like the mutual aid, Kropotkin, on how things were not really commissioned but developed by the workers. The aim of the association was to keep in order the crowds of half nomadic laborers who for half a century or more would establish themselves in town to transmit from one generation to the next the secrets of the craft, and to act as an arbitrator in the quarrels which might arise among this restless population. And that last part, there was a lot of fighting in the guilds, a tremendous amount, like over the course of hundreds of years. So Campanage 2 covered many craft guilds, of which the most important were closely connected with the building. with building. So carpenters, stone cutters, and joiners, or with clothing trades. But it differed from the guilds from the guilds and from Freemasonry in that no masters were admitted. So this was just workers at the time. I mean, like what you could think of as journeymen in their old language. It concerned itself exclusively with obtaining work for the companions and with looking after their professional interests. Nevertheless, it survived all this and it was strong enough to organize strikes and to blacklist the firms which did not accept its conditions, and even in the towns which it was persecuted. So I don't know how this is not a predecessor to unions, because that's what that seems like to me. All right. There's a part in the book that talks about the vices of the guild system, what it says here. People between the crafts, so you had guilds that would divide between the crafts. They would have a lot of infighting, like I was saying. Violence was frequent. Bloody battles for the monopoly of work in a particular town often took place. And so that is something to keep in mind when thinking about the destruction of the guilds. Intellectual conditions, I'll go over this really quick. This was during the time of the Renaissance, and we started having more traditional class division at this time. One of the things that the author, Renard, points out is there's a separation between the artists and the craftsmen, whereas with the guilds, they were the same. So it said that they used to, share the same life and the same ideals. The artist was no longer the interpreter of the thought of the whole people, but working for the rich and powerful bankers or princes who required them to reproduce archaic forms and consequently demanded of him a certain amount of education. He left the ranks of the people, rose to wealth, to the ranks of the upper middle classes, and figured at court. So this is the beginning of the end, where they, as far as the craftsmanship, the artistic side of it, the artists started to receive commissions from the rich and the powerful in order to create their art, so on and so forth. Right. So it's saying that it was harmful to both, and it was another part of the division. Is there a word here? No. Political conditions was it started really being more of a concentration of wealth. You probably heard of the Medicis. There's a coffee shop called Medici. Um, in Florence, they were the top tier guild and kind of the people who were elected to be in the most powerful guilds in Florence. And they just started, you know, doing things in their own self-interest. Uh, and they really just ended a lot of solidarity. So those are external. Let's go to internal, where we're going to talk a little bit more about probably some of that. Yeah. So a lack of solidarity between those who occupied the various degrees of the hierarchy, right? So these are the three things. That was the first one: lack of solidarity, divisions between the different craft guilds, and a narrow traditionalism that could not even ensure the good quality of the products. To me, we the external context is different now. So some things just, if we were to look at these external causes of decay and just like superimpose that over what the state of what a cooperative is in now, some of that stuff is the same. Some of it we grew up in it, so we're familiar with it, and we are able to adjust to it. This stuff over here seems kind of the probably more important. So this lack of solidarity, it seems like in this division, these things seem to be in place and kind of internalized now. So division in the hearts of the guilds. You had the guild hierarchy, which justified its own existence. It's founded on age and election, and inequality in time corrected every day, right? So basically, like I said, you had your apprenticeship, you had upward mobility. That was kind of a promise. Apprenticeship, journeyman, master. Yeah, so like it says here, with those three. Oh, this is interesting. On the other hand, there's a more provisional inequality. Elected officers received for a few months only a power which they exercised under strict control and then went modestly back into the ranks. So this is kind of like how they handled special duties, maybe elected to a committee or so on and so forth. This is kind of what, when you don't do that, you end up having lifetime elections and people in power, and they start to concentrate power. So this beginning of the some of the decay masters, anxious to secure a life of ease for their posterity, filled with a sort of dynastic ambition, made the acquisition of mastership more and more difficult for those who had not the good luck to be their sons and nephews, sons-in-laws. So started having nepotism. This was an example of what was happening in France. It started to be in where a master had to put on banquets, so that means you had to have money, um, and the test became more and more complicated. And then it started being at the point where they just said, in order to be a master, it's going to be hereditary. Journeymen were treated with a growing severity. They're forbidden to set up for themselves. So set up a shop for themselves, they had to be a master. So these were rules that we would think of as kind of like legal rules. You can get kicked out of the guild if you're a journeyman and you tried to set up a shop. But their condition was certainly worse in the 17th century than in the 13th. So that's something that's, like I was saying, this happened over the course of 400 years. The working day, which used to be 12 hours, was prolonged to 16. And so they started working, the masters started working the journeyman more. So there was a division between the craft guilds. One is sometimes tempted to say the guild system had no worse enemies than the guilds themselves, right? So there was all types of fighting. There's an example, a lawsuit between the wine merchants and the 6 guilds lasted 150 years. And then there's a lot of regulations. They were jealous over each other, and they were trying to possess monopolies, so on and so forth. They did not. The vexatious regulations kind of also applied to innovation. So it kind of made it to where this is kind of the fundamental argument against probably a guild system over, you know, against just pure markets and capital and what the entities that we have now. Basically, the argument is that they do not adopt innovation fast enough. They will make rules to make it to where the workers don't have to relearn in order to adapt to new innovations that will allow for more efficiencies. Okay. Let's jump over to this final, round this thing up. Yeah, we know the tendencies of the great commerce guilds. It dislikes all barriers and hindrances to its activity. It always has been more inimical to the system of the closed market, so dear to the small craft guilds. Its ideal is fair trade. So true is that that in France in 1654, the 6 guilds strongly protested against taxes which struck at the importation of goods made outside the kingdom. So this would be like a tariff. So they used to have, like I was saying, they would make rules, guilds would make rules so that there would be tariffs on imports. And then, but the big guilds would say, no, we don't like that. Let's see. All right. So now economists and philosophers united in attacking the guild's principles in the name of liberty and equality, two ideas which roused much enthusiasm in the world at that time. The guilds were denounced as opposed to the general interest of the producers in that they stood for privilege and exclusiveness and prevented numbers of people who could neither enter them nor set up beside them from earning an honest livelihood. So that part right there is something to remember. Like with guilds, they made it to where if you're not part of the guild, you can't set up shop in the city for doing whatever it is you're doing. You know, being a tailor or what have you. They were condemned as being contrary to the general interests of consumers, for burdened with enormous debts, wasting their money in festivals, fees, legal expenses, condemned the laborious methods of manufacturers through their inability to improve them. They were yet able, by means of their monopolies, to keep up prices and make unduly large profits without even being capable of satisfying their clients if they express the smallest desire to have something out of the ordinary. Now, this was a critique against guilds, and these economists and philosophers, these are the capitalists and the early liberal, traditional, classical liberal philosophers. Okay, so here there was no violent rupture with the past, no solemn repudiation of theories hitherto followed, no complete or sudden abolition of the guild system. The change in economic organization came by a series of small, local, and partial measures. So I find that the thing here is there were laws that, counterintuitively, like we don't like this. This seems very strange to us. Um, this The guilds were denounced as opposed to the interests of producers, in that they stood for privileges and exclusiveness and prevented numbers of people who could neither enter them nor set up beside them from earning an honest livelihood. So, if you can remember, guilds, they had people who would do patrols, they would levy fines, they would do things like say, well, if we're not going to come at you physically, you can't buy anything at any of these stores. So they'd lock you out. They had ways of kind of forming or enforcing their rules against you if you broke their, if you try to break their rules, they would enforce them. So that seems wrong. If I want to create in some way, if I want to create, some clothing and open up a shop, that doesn't seem like there should be some type of regulation against it in some way, possibly. But the guilds thought of themselves as being in charge of the quality of anyone selling, within a craft. But on the other side of that, when when that was ruled as we don't, kind of inappropriate, you're limiting freedom of people doing what they want, they made it to where the guilds couldn't exist, right? So this is kind of on the kind of the pendulum swings all the way to the other side. So Turgot, as everyone knows, took upon himself to do away with the wardenships and masterships. A disciple of Gournay and Coisnet, he condemned them in the name of industry and agriculture, and in the interest of consumers and producers. A famous edict of March 1776, which he signed as minister of Louis, what is this, the 16th, declared that they were abolished throughout the kingdom. So he abolished the guilds. And the property of the guilds was sold, and the proceeds, together with the funds in one hand, were used for wiping out their debts. Co-fraternities were done away with at the same time, and their wealth was handed over to the bishops. All associations of masters or journeymen were prohibited. So you couldn't legally be a guild, and that was enforced by the state. Then there were some more that came through. Um, yeah, Melville made a rule that every citizen would be free to carry on whatever profession or trade seems good to him after procured and having procured and paid for a license. This meant that the end of masterships and warderships. So saying that there was some type of mastership that was in charge of a trade and only the people that they approved of could be in the trade, there was no longer that. They made it to where everyone can be free to carry on whatever profession they wanted. Of course, they had to pay for a license. So what essentially is this changed the master from being at a lower level to being at the state level. So there was more like almost for lack of a better term, government employee. So these are some laws where they made it to where citizens of the same conditions or profession, middlemen, and those who keep open shops, workmen, companions, or whatever art may not, when they find themselves together, nominate a president, secretary, uh, syndic, keep registers, pass resolutions, make regulations for what they claim to be their common interests, or bind themselves to agreements leading to the concerted refusal or to the granting only at a certain price of the help of their industry and labors. So they basically, this was the banning of what you would call a union now. It's same kind of thing. Um, yeah, and then February 17th, all guild tribunals were abolished and all their powers vested in the Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. So that is the end. They really, by the 18th century, that was the end of the guilds. And this book, after immediately after, Renard writes a book about unions, where it picks up after this one. The guilds were, and the unions, if you could see there, they were basically the same thing as the guilds. They they were not supposed to exist. They were illegal, and then but they would form anyways, and they would go on strike, and then that's why they were violent, because people would come in and try to, whether it be the state or the corporations, they would try to come in and do old school union busting with guns. So there you go. Does anybody have any questions or comments? We went over it pretty quickly. Let's see here. We'll read this one out. So Brandon says, can you share anything that came up related to education? I know during the Middle Ages, monasteries were influential regarding education. I'm wondering if trade and industry had an influence on education like it does now in the US. My understanding is that American concept of education was driven by certification, especially in engineering fields. I'm reminded of the old Venkatesh Rail article on the role of entrepreneurs in the capitalist system. So he said a bunch of things there. They did talk about education. They, I mean, you can call it education, but the older, what you could call universities, they were also guilds. And let's go over here. I think it's here. Oh, no, we didn't go all the way down here, I don't think. Right. So this is how they were classified, if I remember. So how did you do the separation between the guilds? One of them was, let's see here. Yeah, how are they classified? Whether it was more or less honorable, lucrative, or ancient. So it was one of those three. And the honorable side, I want to say that's the um, where the universities were. So the place of honor. So this is how the guilds were as far as who got elected to the higher level um, kind of committees that would run the whole city and make the rules at the top level. Uh, I wanted to say they had some stuff about education in here. I don't think I grabbed it out, but I know they were in that. They were in this group, and they were somewhat powerful. They were in the same group as the Catholic Church and so on and so forth. Another thing that you were saying was um, the American concept of education was driven by certification, especially in the engineering fields. I'm not familiar with that. What I'm familiar with is we didn't do a book review on it, but we did a paper on it that the education and exploitation and learning, I think is the name. This might have been like 6 years ago or 7 years ago now. It's been a while. But there is a book drawn from, it's called The Hidden History of Education in the United States. And from my understanding, our education system is driven from the Prussian system, so Germany. But this is talking about regular schooling, like elementary to high school. And it was supposed to be more of like they made a difference between a separation between schooling and education. So schooling was okay, you're having to basically those things that would make you an obedient person that could be a cog in a machine kind of thing. And then you had what Woodrow Wilson called a liberal education, which would be someone who would receive training in critical thinking and those types of things that would allow you to manage the people that receive the other type of education. So I didn't see too much here about that subject, and I don't know about what you were saying here with the engineering fields. Yeah,
Yeah,
go
it,
ahead.
no, that's super helpful. I think you did a good. You covered the question well. I think the thing I was curious about. So Venkatesh Rao, like in this article from like 10 years ago, he basically talks about entrepreneurs because that's kind of like this thing that's touted like in American culture of like, oh, start your own business. Um, as like a prestigious thing to do, I guess, or even though it's like something that's been going on for a very long time, he traces it back to the steel industry, basically looking at how did they kind of corner the market, like who could be included and who was excluded, and they used education as like a barrier to entry, like that you had to be certified. So like when I'm talking about education, it's more from specialization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we get into like I'm like thinking about how does like what happened back then kind of have ripple effects or like similarities to now. Like I think we have a lot of high tech fields, but also the barriers to entry seem high. Like not everyone is able to do those things. So I was just kind of curious, like, did they have like a similar issue with kind of getting people to go through like apprenticeships,
Yeah.
and other things like that?
Yeah, I mean that's for sure. It was the idea, the whole thing going back over here to um the, this economic aim. Uh the guild prided itself on letting nothing leave its shop but finished products, perfect of their kind. It examined and stamped every article and all that. How did it do this? It made regulations. You had to go through, you had to be an apprentice, then you became a journeyman, then you became a master. Apprentices can only do certain things. Journeymen can only do certain things, and that was enforced by them, as in they will escort you out the city if you break the rules, kind of thing. Um, right. So, and they levied fines on you, all this stuff. They go into in depth on how they would enforce fines. They had, so for instance, and I don't have it in here, if you were to, so just to talk about, let's say the equivalent of, you brought up tech now, and if there was some type of certification that you had to have in order to do something, we really don't have that much there. But if you were to say accountant, to have to be a CPA, you have to pass the test and all that. Otherwise, you get in trouble. Obviously, to be a lawyer, you got to pass the bar. That kind of thing. Back then, they had certifications, and then that's good. Good. Let's do lawyer and CPA, but let's do lawyer. You pass the bar, and it only works within a state. You can't do it in more than one state. Like you can't practice law in another state. Go to jail. Okay, so how did that happen back then? So they were doing that for things like being a tailor. And if you were in another city and came to Florence and you tried to be a tailor, they would put you in jail. If you did that in Florence and then you tried to run off, they would send people after you to get you. Like they had a elaborate system of regulations, rules, how they would punish you and all that. And then, but it was weird because it would also have little ways of reconciling as well. So there wasn't really a lot of death penalty going on, but there was a lot of, you're going to have to repay the damage that you did, kind of thing. But they had it and they enforced it.
So all right, last question. I just
Mhm.
had a thought.
Mhm.
When people say free trade or like free market enterprise, they're complaining about the stuff that happened in the 1400s.
Yeah, there was markets that all the way. If you go to our mutual aid videos that we did, there were markets back in. If you ever seen the movie The Highlander, where they had clans, where it was a group of 100 people or 50 people, they had a market there too, where they had these buildings, or they were maybe four family um homes, you could call them encampments types things, where four families would live. And they would have a place where, between all of those buildings, where people went to trade, and that place was kind of a sanctified place. There couldn't be any fighting there, all this stuff like that. And he um Kropotkin is the guy who wrote Mutual Aid. He makes the argument that these, of course, these rules were created with no state. Markets are kind of a part of people trying to help each other, where they're having a trade. He calls that place where they were, what we would call the market now, where people are going to, and back then, what were they making? A spear or whatever, some clothing. He calls that the communal area. That would be the commune, right? So nobody owns it, right? And but everybody takes care of it, and there's rules around it. And so markets go back to that, and that he makes the argument that that's in, not just in Europe, but that's everywhere, Africa, China, wherever. And then you had feudalism, and then these medieval cities. This is where you got away from the feudal lords, even though feudal lords also didn't run everything everywhere. And then you've had markets in a city, where before the medieval cities, there was another evolution between clans and medieval cities. There were, what do you call it, encampments, and the encampments where, and they represent this age in different, um movies and stuff like that. But you're talking about the 10th century and 12th century or previous. They were basically built so to where all of the families that were inside of the encampments, it's kind of like a village, what you would think of. They're able to protect each other, right? They had a surrounding, almost like a wall, but not really. And then that was part of their mutual aid. Of course, they would fish, they would do whatever, but when it's time to fight, they all got together and fight. And they had markets in there too, going back to an evolution from the clan. So, yeah, markets are not synonymous with capital. Um, Richard Wolff makes the argument that there were markets during slavery. There were slave markets, and that wasn't capitalism, right? Nobody at that point, capital doesn't claim slavery to be capitalism, right? So markets and capitalism are not synonymous.
Awesome. All right,
Yeah.
last question, and I'm gonna leave space for other people. All right, freelancer. The term freelancer. What, I guess, like, is it before or after this time period? Because I associated that with like I don't know, mercenaries for hire.
Oh, freelancer. That's a good question. I wanted to say that was more of a modern term. That might be an old term. I don't know. Independent contractor kind of thing. It don't the I would argue that you would go previous to this because this is about the medieval times. People are already advanced societies with elaborate rules. But if you were to go back to like again the times of clans, let's say, uh there was already mutual aid at that point. You could go to time of hunter gatherers. It's you it doesn't seem like there's a lot of lone wolves going on. So I don't know. As far as mercenaries, it's a good question. When did mercenaries emerge? But mercenaries really aren't individual. They're not really freelancers either. They work together in groups. So uh, it seems like when you're talking about more like a lone wolf for hire, and it's frowned upon, especially in these like medieval times. They really did not like foreigners. They were really not trusted. So if you went into the city, like kind of like the old westerns, almost, these um, films where they depict the stranger coming into the city, and they're like, "Who's this person?" And they go into the bar, the tavern, or whatever, and they're kind of frowning at them or what have you. It's really they didn't have a trust. You're not part of the guilds. You're not going to be able to buy anything or sell anything. Maybe you don't know the rules. You're going to act inappropriately. Someone's going to have to correct you. It might be a fight. All of that stuff. So I don't know. It's a good question though.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else have something?